All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a short video on the difference between academic sources and popular sources. We're also going to be talking about types of bias. So as we begin to do a little bit more research, these are all things that I want you to be keeping in mind. So let's start by talking about bias, because it is something that comes up, and as human beings, it's kind of inevitable that we have some sort of bias, and I would even argue that it's impossible for us to avoid any bias. But there are a couple significant types of bias that can negatively impact the research that we're doing. So let's just start with a couple questions. And these are two questions that I would suggest that you keep in mind as you're doing your research, which is, number one, what biases might the author have? And number two, what biases might the reader have? So we as the reader. Now, again, I would argue that it's pretty impossible, or if not very, very difficult, to be completely unbiased in a text, at least in the type of research that we're doing. So the harm or the downside comes when we combine our biases with an author's bias, and then we can kind of have something that will lead us to a clearly biased conclusion. So what we're trying to do with all of this is avoid any unnecessary or really extreme bias, because again, we are humans and we are biased by nature. So we're going to take a look at some types of bias that I find come up a lot in academic writing and research, and you will probably see these around you in your daily lives as well as you go about kind of navigating the world. So I just kind of want you to be aware of when and where these might occur and how they might impact the research that we're doing. So perhaps the most common is confirmation bias. Now, this happens, again, quite often, and it's something that we can witness on social media and certain news sites. And what happens here is that we, as readers, are looking at sources or authors whose arguments only confirm our ideas. That is, we're looking at something that confirms our suspicions, and we find out that the source, since the source kind of jives with what we are thinking, then we feel justified in a certain conclusion. Now, on the surface, this might not sound like a bad thing, right? In essence, that's kind of what we're doing when we do research. That is, we're setting out to confirm a hypothesis. But confirmation bias is actually a little bit different than that. So when we talk about confirmation bias, what we're doing, and you can kind of see it in this graphic representation, is that we engage in a bias that blinds us to kind of the bigger picture out there. So let's just say that I wanted to find out if a certain product X, is a bad product, and I search something like problems with product X. So all I'm going to get as return results in that search is the problems with the product, and that might not represent the broader or more objective truth about this product. So, and in order to avoid this type of bias, what we want to look for is disconfirming information. So disconfirming data is something that we might look at when we say, instead of just problems with product X, we might look at advantages of product X, or we might simply look at something like reviews of product X. So again, when we're engaged in confirmation bias, usually it occurs in these search terms, so that when we go to look into an issue, we're only looking for information that directly confirms our initial bias that we have as readers or researchers. Now, anchoring bias is one that happens quite often, and you can see it around you, and we can talk about this more if you're interested. But this particular type of bias I find fascinating. So Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky kind of illustrated this rather well with the example that's on the next slide. And anchoring bias is basically what happens when you are anchored to the first thing that you see. So let's look at the example here. And when I do this in person, usually ask students on one side of the classroom to do the problem on the left and students on the other side of the classroom to do the problem on the right. And I give people about 30 seconds to do the math, and then I hide the math and I ask, what do you think the answer was? Now, from my experience, I find that students who do the problem on the left come up around 2,000, maybe something like that, right? So the answer they think is about 2,000. The actual average answer that Kahneman and Tversky found was 2,250, just for food for thought. Now, students who do the problem on the other side of the screen, the right-hand side, usually come up with an answer around, say, 200 or 250. And Kahneman and Tversky found that it was 512 in their average. So again, it just depends. I was doing it very informally, and I'm sure that they were doing it in a very controlled setting. Now, the actual answer is 40,320. So this is what happens when we are anchored to the first bit of information. In this case, the first bit of information is the first number, the first couple numbers. So we look at the one on the left and we see, well, 8 times 7, okay, that's 56 times 6. So we're already starting with a rather large number. Whereas if we're looking at the one on the right, we are anchored to the 1 and the 2, and 1 times 2 is simply 2. So we assume that it's going to be a rather smaller number. So how does this happen in research? When people are researching and they type into Google or Academic Search Complete or JSTOR, whatever they're using, a lot of the time they will find an article, they'll read it, and they will automatically believe that, or not automatically, but often, I should say, believe that first article is the best article. And perhaps you've experienced this. I know I have done this when I'm researching things for my own purposes, that whatever comes up first on Google, I'm like, okay, that sounds legit. It was the first thing that popped up. It's probably the best answer. So again, we want to avoid that. And the best way to avoid that is to continue to research and to continue to have an open mind about the information that we have. And remember that anchoring bias is an actual cognitive bias. Now, the next one is recency bias. And like confirmation bias, this may not sound like a bad thing on the surface. Recency bias simply means that we are biased towards the most recent information. In some cases, we might actually prefer the more recent information, right? So let's say we are researching artificial intelligence or researching something in the medical field. It's fairly likely that the more recent information is the best or most accurate information. However, if we're looking at only the more recent information and disregarding older information, we're falling into a type of bias. So the way to think about this is, let's say in a class, in your math class, you've taken, 4 out of 5 quizzes and you did really well on the first 3, but you bombed the 4th one. Maybe it was a bad day, maybe you didn't have time to study, whatever the circumstances surrounding that poor performance were. If your instructor says, well, that student is not getting any of the information because they really didn't do well on this test and they're only focusing on your most recent exam, then they're disregarding the other information that they have, which is your good performance on the first 3. So again, what we want to do is we want to take into account all of the information. And again, we can see this, especially in things like medical research, where new information comes out and it may come out rather rapidly, but it may be flawed or it may not be the big picture, the complete picture. I would say, just again, for the sake of thought of clarification, one place that I feel like I see this pretty often is with fad diets, where people will say, well, this recent diet is the best, and it's just not been studied enough and we don't know what the long-term negative impacts are. So something looks great just because it's brand new. Now, here's a visual representation of recency bias. So we can see that left-hand column that the average snowfall in January in Park City, Utah was rather high, but in 2012, it was low. And so this person would be asking, why did I buy a 4-wheel drive if it's not snowed this much or very much this year? Well, again, we might not be looking at, hey, the past 15 or 20 years, we've had a lot of snowfall. In fact, that is the average snowfall is pretty high. So maybe we had a warmer than average year, and we're going to let that influence our decision making. So again, looking at big picture, taking into account as much information as we possibly can is well worth our time. So let's look at the last one here. So the fourth example that we're going to talk about is authority bias. So, and again, we see this quite often, and there are a number of reasons that this is something that we want to avoid. Again, to be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with trusting an expert in their field, so long as the person's authority is not the only reason that we are trusting them. So this is where it becomes important to see how sources overlap and how they agree with each other, and that, you know, we're not just trusting something because they're source because the person who wrote it is a doctor, right? So it's best to have a good, healthy sense of skepticism here. And I would say that advertisers know that we're very prone to authority bias, which is why we get things like this, where we get an advertisement that says, hey, you know, trust us, here are some doctors, but it's not taking into account the bigger picture. We don't know, say, who did this study. We don't know all of the other things that go into it. So before we just snap to that assumption that, hey, because these people are experts, this must be the best product, we want to, you know, make sure that we are going out doing due diligence and checking out all of the other options. Now, the last thing that I want to go over here is a side note on a sort of cognitive bias. And it's not necessarily one that will come up in research, but it will come up often in student writing or in other people's writing. So this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So it is absolutely fascinating and something that I have seen in practice in my own classrooms when I've asked students to rate or grade their own papers. And usually students who don't have much experience writing or are kind of new to maybe research think that they're doing extremely well because they don't have the experience or the knowledge to draw from to let them know, hey, I have some weaknesses here that I need to shore up. So here's our visual representation for this one. So we've got this person who thought that because they were really good at swimming short distances of 200 meters, that it would be totally fine and reasonable for them to swim 19 miles, which is something like 30 kilometers. So that's a really big change. So there's a sort of false sense of confidence. Now, I don't know that I see a whole lot of this, again, in the realm of research, but I do feel that it's something that we should keep in mind as we're doing research, because we might feel like we are an expert because we've read one or two articles. But again, we really need to make sure that we are getting out there and doing due diligence to find all of the different sources to make sure that we have all of the information. And here in this rather amusing graph, at least as far as I see it, we have the y-axis, right? That is confidence, and the x-axis, which is wisdom, which is knowledge plus experience, at least in their definition. And you can see that with the least amount of knowledge and experience, people have the highest level of confidence in their ability. Is this always the case? No, but it is documented. It's pretty common. And then as people move towards kind of average knowledge and experience, they are kind of in that place where they're like, I kind of know, I'm kind of somewhat confident. And then as we become more expert, we begin to grow in confidence again. So as you're researching these things, I would say it's best to keep in mind that both readers and writers have their own personal cognitive biases. A professor teaching environmental science is going to believe in the necessity and importance of environmental science, and there's nothing wrong with that as a bias. But it might mean that that professor is biased towards things that confirm their beliefs without fully investigating the scope of an issue. Now, I hope that that's not really the case, but for the sake of example, we're going to go with it. So I think as human beings, we tend to see things as binary, as rather either or, and we often don't take into account the fact that things are gradients or that they are nuanced. And especially when we're researching something, it's best to avoid thinking of something as, you know, either this or that, because it sort of negates or discounts all of the things that happen in between. So there you go. I hope that helps and kind of gives you some food for thought as we begin thinking about how we research and some of the biases that we might bring into things as we're conducting our research, as well as some of the biases that authors might have as they are putting together their essays. All right, so there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later.